The once vibrant world of Earth was now a husk, its cities shattered and its landscapes barren, scared by the ravages of endless wars and unyielding alien oppression. The Dominion, a galactic empire of ancient alien species, had invaded centuries ago, stripping Earth of its resources, subjugating its people, and leaving them to wither in the shadows of forgotten history. Human resistance had been crushed time and time again, and the few survivors now lived in the underworld, hidden from the watchful eyes of the Dominion's brutal enforcers. Deep beneath what remained of the capital, in the ruins of a city once known as New York, a small ragtag group of human survivors had found refuge. These survivors were the last hope of humanity, a desperate alliance of scientists, soldiers, and former leaders who had sworn to fight until the very last breath. Captain Elara Smith, a former military strategist and leader of the last free human faction, stood at the center of a hidden underground facility, staring at a holographic map of Earth's war-torn surface. Her mind raced, the weight of command heavier than ever. She was surrounded by a small team of soldiers and researchers, all equally committed to a mission that had no guarantees of success. There were no more allies left in the galaxy, no more reinforcements coming. It was up to them, only them, to save humanity. Captain, the scans are clear. We've pinpointed the location. Dr. Eiko Tanaka, the team's lead scientist, said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. Her fingers danced across the control panel, projecting a schematic of an ancient underground complex located miles beneath the ruins of the old city. This is it, the artifact we've been searching for. If it's what we think it is, it could be the key to turning the tide. Elara turned to face her, her expression hardened. You're certain? After all this time, after all the searches, this is it? Eiko nodded. It's the last thing we haven't explored, and the readings, they're unlike anything we've ever seen. The artifact they sought had been rumored to be the legacy of humanity's forgotten past, before the Dominion erased their history. It was said to be a device capable of bending reality, a weapon with unimaginable power. If it was real, it could change everything. The Dominion had stripped Earth of its resources, decimated its military, and enslaved its people, but they had never been able to fully erase humanity's potential. The knowledge of that power had been lost, until now. Elara adjusted her worn combat armor, the faded insignia of Earth's fallen military barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime. Prepare the team, we're moving out. If we're right, this artifact could be humanity's last chance. As the team gathered their gear, Elara's mind drifted briefly to the faces of the fallen, friends, comrades, those who had given everything for the cause. She couldn't afford to dwell on them. They were gone, and it was up to her now. Humanity was at the edge of extinction. They had no time to waste. The team descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. The path was narrow and treacherous, filled with the remnants of old machinery and forgotten technology. There was no time to second-guess their actions. As they approached the location, Elara felt the unmistakable chill of dread settle in her chest. Something was wrong. "Captain, we've got movement," said Lieutenant Victor Duval, his voice gruff, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Multiple contacts. This place isn't as abandoned as we thought." A cold shiver ran down Elara's spine. "Stay alert, we might not be alone." Before she could give another order, the sound of clanging metal reverberated through the halls, followed by the low hum of energy weapons charging. The Dominion was here. The trap had been set. The sound of metal scraping against the cold concrete echoed through the narrow corridors, sending a ripple of tension through Elara's team. They weren't alone. The Dominion had known they were coming, and the fact that they had been able to track them this far into the heart of a supposedly abandoned complex meant one thing: the stakes had just been raised. Elara motioned for everyone to take cover behind the nearest bulkhead. The team swiftly moved into position, their weapons ready, eyes scanning the shadows. Victor Duval, the team's sharpshooter, adjusted his visor and whispered, "There's at least a dozen of them. Executors, I bet my last ration. We're outnumbered." Ilara nodded grimly. Executors were the Dominion's elite, genetically enhanced soldiers, humans twisted into ruthless killers through experimentation. They were relentless and deadly, and they had been hunting humanity for generations. "What's the plan, Captain?" Aiko's voice broke through the tension, her fingers hovering over a datapad linked to the facility's power systems. "We need to reach the artifact now. We can't afford to lose it. But we'll need a distraction to get past them," Ilara said, her mind working quickly. The artifact, buried deep within the facility's ancient chambers, was their last hope. It held the knowledge of humanity's forgotten past, a past that could unlock unimaginable power, power that could change the tide of war, but they had to reach it first. "We can't outrun them," Victor said, his voice low. "So we'll have to fight. Let me take the lead. I can pick them off one by one if we draw them out." Ilara's eyes flickered to Aiko, who was still staring at the datapad. Aiko's hands shook slightly, but she was focused. "The power grid's ancient, but it's still active. If I can bypass the security systems, we can trigger a power surge, blow the circuit panels. It'll give us a few minutes to move, maybe even knock out their comms." "Do it," Ilara said, her voice hard. She didn't have time to argue. They had one shot. Aiko quickly got to work, her fingers flying over the controls. The rest of the team readied their weapons, knowing what was coming. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the dark corridor ahead, listening for any signs of movement. The air was thick with tension, and the silence pressed down on them like a weight. Then, without warning, the hallway was flooded with bright lights. The Dominion soldiers had found them. "Now, Aiko," Ilara barked. The scientist slammed her fist down on the final control, triggering a surge of power that coursed through the building. The lights flickered, then exploded in a burst of white-hot energy, momentarily blinding everyone. The hum of the Dominion's advanced tech cut off, and a loud crack echoed as electrical panels overloaded, sparks flying in every direction. "Go! Move!" Ilara shouted. The team sprinted forward, rushing through the smoke-filled hallway, guns raised. Victor took the lead, picking off two executors who had been momentarily stunned by the power surge. Their bodies crumpled to the floor as Ilara and the others followed closely behind. As they moved deeper into the complex, Ilara's mind raced. This place wasn't just a facility, it was something more. She could feel it in the walls. The air hummed with energy, and the deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the building itself was alive, remembering things it shouldn't. They reached the central chamber, the door towering in front of them. The space beyond was bathed in an eerie glow. The artifact lay in the center of the room, encased in a field of crackling energy. Ilara stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. The sight of it, the strange, alien object, was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Its surface was smooth, like polished obsidian, etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with ancient knowledge. For a moment, Ilara felt as though the artifact was calling to her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand, but somehow knew deep within her soul. It was a connection to a past long buried, a legacy of humanity's true potential. Aiko, still breathing heavily, took her place next to Ilara. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's not just human. It's something else." Ilara nodded, the weight of their discovery sinking in. "This is humanity's gift, and we'll be damned if we let the Dominion take it from us." Before they could approach further, a harsh voice echoed from the doorway. "You're too late, humans." Ilara spun around, her heart sinking as the remaining executors, dozens of them, filed into the room, weapons raised. The leader, a towering figure in black armor, stepped forward, his glowing red eyes fixed on Ilara. "You'll never awaken what's hidden here," he sneered. This place is beyond your understanding. You are not worthy of this power. Ilara's grip tightened on her weapon. We'll see about that. The final battle for humanity's future had just begun. The air in the chamber crackled with tension. Ilara's pulse quickened as the towering executor stepped forward, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. You truly believe you can control it? He mocked, his hand tightening around the hilt of his energy blade. You are nothing but remnants of a broken species. This artifact was never meant for you. Behind him, the remaining executors stood ready, their advanced weaponry humming with deadly intent. Ilara's team, though outnumbered, was determined not to surrender. Victor, his sniper rifle aimed at the executor leader's chest, subtly gestured to the others to fall into formation. We'll see about that, Ilara replied, her voice calm but firm. This artifact belongs to humanity, and we're taking it back. Eiko stepped forward, her eyes locked on the artifact. We don't have much time, she said, her voice filled with urgency. I can start unlocking the core, but we need to create a distraction. Otherwise, they'll kill us before we even get the chance. Ilara nodded, signaling Victor to take position near the back. The team needed to keep the executors distracted long enough for Eiko to tap into the artifact's power, whatever it was. If they could just unlock its secrets, humanity might stand a chance against the Dominion. Without warning, Victor fired a shot. The bolt of energy struck one of the executors square in the chest, sending the alien soldier crashing to the ground. The remaining executors reacted instantly, leaping into action. The leader growled in fury and raised his energy blade, while the others unleashed a barrage of laser fire toward Victor, forcing him to retreat behind cover. Now, Eiko, Ilara shouted. Eiko's hands flew over the control panel, a mixture of determination and fear on her face. As the battle raged around them, Ilara's mind raced. They were fighting not just for survival, but for the future of humanity itself. The artifact was their last chance, a key to unlocking the power of their forgotten ancestors. But as much as she believed in the cause, doubt gnawed at her. Could they really harness something so ancient, so powerful? The room trembled with an otherworldly hum as the artifact came to life, its black surface rippling like liquid. The symbols etched into it glowed with a fierce light, and for a moment, it felt as though the very fabric of reality was warping around them. Ilara felt a surge of energy pulse through her body vibrating with the artifact's power. It was a strange sensation, intense yet strangely comforting, as if the artifact itself recognized her presence. Humanity's long-lost legacy was awakening. Eiko stumbled back, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. It's activating, but it's not responding the way I thought it would. Ilara turned to her. What do you mean? The artifact, Eiko gasped, struggling to find the words. It's not just unlocking human potential, it's amplifying it. It's like it's reading our minds, our fears, our desires. It's making us better. As the words left her mouth, Ilara felt it, the power thrumming through her veins. Her senses heightened in an instant. The world around her seemed to slow, her reflexes becoming razor-sharp. She could feel the energy of the room, the pulse of the artifact, and the heartbeats of every executor standing in the room. It was as though the very essence of the universe was opening up to her. The executor leader's eyes flickered with confusion, his arrogant sneer faltering. What is this? What are you doing to me? Ilara didn't hesitate. With a surge of newfound power, she raised her hand, and an invisible force slammed the executor into the wall, pinning him there with an unyielding grip. The remaining executors tried to move, but their movements were sluggish, as though time itself had slowed around them. Now, Ilara barked to her team. Victor, his eyes wide with disbelief, took a shot at the nearest executor, his aim perfect as the bullet ripped through the alien's armor. The executor collapsed, stunned and incapacitated. Eiko, still shaking from the overwhelming surge of power, activated another control on the artifact, sending a pulse of energy rippling through the room. The power was like nothing they had ever felt before. Suddenly, the remaining executors began to stagger, their once immense confidence shattered as the raw energy from the artifact washed over them. The artifact was no longer just a tool, it was a living force, amplifying humanity's latent potential, turning them into something the Dominion never expected. One of the executors, an elite soldier with glowing red eyes, lunged at Alara. She barely had time to react, but the artifact's power seemed to guide her every movement. Without even thinking, she raised her hand, and with a twist of her wrist, the air around the executor vibrated, crushing his body in an invisible force. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, and the room fell silent. Aiko's voice broke the stillness. "We did it. We." Before she could finish, the ground beneath them began to shake violently, and the chamber's walls began to crack. The artifact's energy was unstable, too powerful. The surge had triggered something beyond their control. "We need to leave now," Alara shouted, but even as she spoke, the artifact pulsed again, its light blinding. The ground split open beneath their feet, and a massive explosion tore through the chamber. In that instant, Alara realized that humanity's last hope wasn't just about reclaiming the past, it was about reshaping the future. But whether they could control this power, or if it would consume them all, was a question that would have to wait. For now, the fight was just beginning. The explosion tore through the chamber with a deafening roar. Alara felt the ground shake violently beneath her, the walls of the facility crumbling as if they were little more than paper. The artifact pulsed with a blinding light, its power threatening to consume everything in its vicinity. A shockwave of energy surged outward, sending the team flying, crashing into the debris-strewn floor. The room was filled with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. "Everyone okay?" Alara called, her voice hoarse from the shockwave. She pushed herself up from the rubble, her body still humming with the residual energy from the artifact. Victor groaned as he stood, shaking dust from his armor. "Yeah, just a little singed. That was intense." Aiko, who had been thrown across the room, staggered to her feet, her face pale and wide-eyed. "The artifact, it's changing. It's not just amplifying us anymore. It's rewriting reality." Alara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked back at the artifact, which still lay at the center of the chamber, its dark surface now crackling with blue energy. The symbols had shifted, now glowing with a bright, almost violent intensity. The air around it hummed, and the very fabric of space seemed to bend and warp as though the artifact was rewriting the laws of physics themselves. "We've awakened something we don't fully understand," Alara muttered, her mind racing. The power they had unleashed was beyond anything they had ever anticipated. Humanity had always been resilient, but this was different. "We need to control it," Aiko said, stepping forward, her eyes locked on the artifact. "If we don't, it could tear this place apart, and with it, all of us." Victor's hand instinctively went to his rifle, his expression grim. "If we don't stop it, the Dominion will come, and we'll be sitting ducks with this power in our hands." Alara's heart pounded. The Dominion's executors were still out there, and they had no idea how long it would take for reinforcements to arrive. They couldn't afford to let the artifact fall into their hands, nor could they let it spiral out of control. But there was another, more pressing issue. Whatever they had unleashed, it was beginning to corrupt the very environment around them. The ground cracked open, sending ripples through the floor. The walls began to shift, as if the facility itself was alive, its ancient systems fighting to maintain equilibrium. It felt as though the room itself was folding in on them. "Alara," Aiko shouted, pointing at the artifact. "It's pulling the power from the facility itself. It's feeding on everything around it." The artifact's pulse intensified. The air became thick with energy, and Alara could feel it tugging at her mind, beckoning her closer, filling her with a strange sense of urgency. The more she fought the pull, the harder it became to focus. Her hands trembled, and she clenched them into fists, trying to regain control. "We have to stop it." "Now," she said, her voice more strained. "Eiko, can you override the power grid and shut it down?" Eiko nodded, but her face was filled with fear. "I'm not sure it's possible. This is beyond anything the original engineers could have foreseen. It's not just a weapon, it's a force of nature." Elara's gaze flicked to Victor, who had moved toward the far corner of the room, where the remnants of a shattered control console lay. "Victor, what's the status on the secondary systems?" He didn't look back as he worked, his voice low. "I'm trying, but these systems are ancient. If we don't do something soon, it'll collapse everything in its wake." As if in response, the building groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the structure. Elara's instincts screamed at her to act, but the artifact's influence on her thoughts made her hesitate. She felt the energy in the room grow oppressive, as if it were closing in on her, filling her with a sense of desperation and exhilaration. "We need to move now, Elara," Victor urged, his voice tense. "If we don't stop this, the whole facility is going to come down around us." Elara took a steadying breath, trying to focus through the mental fog. There had to be a way to control it, to contain its power before it consumed them all. Her eyes flickered back to Eiko, who was frantically typing into a small console, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've got it," Eiko said, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I found a shutdown sequence, but it's risky. If we try to shut it down completely, we may trigger a self-destruct sequence. The artifact could explode in a matter of seconds." Elara's heart skipped a beat. The stakes had just gotten higher. If they tried to shut it down, they risked destroying everything. If they didn't, the artifact would continue to grow, warping reality and giving the Dominion an unimaginable weapon. The choice was clear, but it was a terrible one. "Do it," Elara ordered. "We can't let this fall into the wrong hands." Eiko hesitated for only a moment before hitting the final key. The room shook violently as the shutdown sequence began, and the artifact's energy flared brighter than ever. A terrible, heart-stopping sound filled the air as the fabric of reality itself seemed to tear. It was now or never. The shutdown sequence initiated, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The artifact's pulsating light flickered erratically, then flared with a blinding intensity. Elara's body jerked as the air itself seemed to warp, bending around the artifact's force. She instinctively shielded her eyes, feeling the pressure building in her chest, as though the very atmosphere was becoming too dense to breathe. "Hold on," Eiko shouted, her voice almost lost in the roaring hum of energy that surged from the artifact. "It's not stabilizing. The shutdown, it's not working the way we thought." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the entire structure of the facility groaned in protest, its ancient systems failing under the weight of the artifact's power. Elara's thoughts raced. They had known this was a possibility. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a force that defied comprehension, and now it was too late to stop. Eiko was still frantically typing commands into the console, her fingers moving faster than Elara could follow. Sweat beaded on her brow as she tried to override the artifact systems. "I can't," she grunted in frustration, her face pale. "I'm losing control. It's adapting to every command we give it." The artifact's light intensified again, more violent than before. A series of high-pitched shrieks reverberated through the room, a sound so alien and unnatural that it pierced into their bones. Elara felt the hairs on her neck stand on end as the air seemed to crackle and tear. The artifact's power was consuming everything, the building, their bodies, their minds. A strange, cold sensation washed over her, and suddenly, Elara found herself looking at the artifact not just with her eyes, but with a deeper sense of perception. She could feel it now, its ancient energy resonating within her, as if the very fibers of her being were becoming one with it. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a conduit to something far greater. Humanity's forgotten legacy, its lost knowledge, its untapped potential was all within reach. For a split second, Ilara wondered if this was what it had all been leading to. Was this the true purpose of humanity's existence, to unlock this power and wield it against their oppressors? But before she could dive deeper into the thought, she heard Eiko scream. "Get away from it," Eiko shouted, but it was too late. The artifact exploded with a deafening crack, and Ilara felt herself being hurled backward, as if the force of the blast had turned the very air into solid matter. The world around her dissolved into a blur of flashing light, darkness, and deafening noise. It was like being torn apart by a storm of unimaginable magnitude. In an instant, everything stopped. Ilara gasped for air, her body aching from the impact. Her vision was blurry, and her head spun from the disorienting force of the explosion. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her thoughts, but the ringing in her ears made it difficult to focus. "Victor?" she called out hoarsely, her voice weak. "I'm here," came his strained reply, and she saw him stagger into view, his face bruised but otherwise unharmed. His hand shot out to steady her as she struggled to sit up. "We're still alive, but we need to get out of here." Eiko was already on her feet, her face flushed with panic. "It's not over, Ilara," she said, her voice tight with fear. Something's wrong. The fabric of reality, it's shifting." Ilara slowly pushed herself up, her legs unsteady. The world around them seemed distorted. The walls of the facility were no longer static. They shifted and warped like they were made of liquid. The very air vibrated, and in the distance, she could see flashes of unfamiliar landscapes flickering in and out of existence. It was as though time and space itself had begun to unravel. "It's the artifact," Eiko explained, her voice barely audible over the unnerving hum that filled the room. "It wasn't just a weapon, it was a doorway, a link to something beyond our understanding, and we just opened it." Ilara turned to look at the shattered remnants of the artifact. Where it had once been, there was now only a pulsating rift in the very fabric of reality. The edges of the rift were jagged, glowing with an unnatural light, and the distortions rippling from it were growing stronger. Someone was coming through. "This is bad," Victor muttered, his hand tightening on his weapon as he scanned the room for any sign of enemy forces. But the danger wasn't just external anymore. The rift, whatever it was, seemed to be pulling at them, as though it had sensed their presence. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the shifting air, a voice that wasn't coming from any of them, but from beyond. It was deep, ancient, and filled with an eerie resonance that seemed to reverberate within their very bones. "You dare open the door to this realm?" The voice boomed, as though it were speaking from every direction at once. "You are not ready." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of the rift was not a force they could fight. They were dealing with something far older and more powerful than anything they had ever imagined. The rift pulsed again, and Ilara realized with chilling certainty that humanity's last hope might not just be to fight the Dominion. It might be to survive the entities that were now slipping through the cracks of their reality. And time was running out. The voice reverberated through the room, a chilling echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ilara's heart raced, her body tensing instinctively as the rift continued to pulse with an otherworldly energy. She could feel the air around her crackling with static, the very particles of reality warping and shifting. It was as if the laws of physics were bending under the weight of the force coming through. Eiko stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, lost in the reverberations of the voice. "What is that thing?" Ilara couldn't answer. She could only stare, transfixed by the rift's growing intensity. The energy emanating from it felt suffocating, like 1,000 storm clouds gathered in a single point, each one filled with violent, primal power. The strange lights flickered again, revealing impossible shapes just beyond the edge of perception. Shapes that seemed to twist in and out of existence, as though they were something not meant to exist within their reality. Victor clenched his rifle, his knuckles white from the grip. We need to get out of here, now. Alara's thoughts raced. Victor was right, but running seemed almost futile. The rift was no longer a passive force. It was alive, pulling at the edges of their world like a great maw that could swallow them whole. If they didn't act fast, it would tear through them and everything else, and the Dominion would be the least of their concerns. Stay calm, Alara said, trying to steady her breathing as she took a step toward the rift. Aiko, what do we do? How can we close it? I don't know, Aiko replied, her voice shaking with fear. This isn't just some technology. It's ancient. It's beyond anything I've ever seen. We can't shut it down with force. We'd only make it worse. As she spoke, the rifts seemed to respond, its pulsing energy intensifying in waves. The walls of the facility groaned again, the very structure itself buckling under the strain. In the distance, Alara could hear the sound of alarm sirens blaring, and she realized with a sickening lurch that the Dominion was likely already on its way. They had no time to waste. Suddenly, another voice, this one more human, cut through the chaos. You will not control it, human. Alara whipped around to see a figure standing in the doorway of the chamber. Tall, cloaked in dark armor, and with an air of cold certainty, the figure was unmistakable, an executor. His eyes glowed a menacing red, and his stance was that of a warrior who had faced down the most impossible odds. You've made a grave mistake, the executor said, his voice calm but filled with underlying menace. The artifact is not a weapon, it is a key, and you have opened the door to something that should never have been disturbed. The figure's presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. Alara's mind raced. They had barely survived the initial confrontation with the executors. Now, they were facing a far more dangerous enemy. The executor before them wasn't just a soldier. He was something far more ancient, connected to whatever lay beyond the rift. What is this thing? Aiko asked, her voice trembling. The executor's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. You call it an artifact, but it is a doorway, a connection to the beyond. It has always been there, waiting for those foolish enough to summon it. Beyond, Alara repeated, her heart pounding. What do you mean? The beyond, the executor said, as if speaking to a child, is where our true enemies come from. You have opened the path to their realm, and now you will pay the price. Alara's gaze flicked to the rift, which had begun to flicker erratically. The shapes she saw there were becoming clearer, figures, forms, things that shouldn't be. They were massive, vast, their outlines shifting in ways that made her stomach churn. She could sense their presence, an ancient intelligence that predated the Dominion, the artifact, and even humanity itself. And they were watching her, watching all of them. It is too late to stop them, the executor intoned, his voice growing quieter, yet more insistent. The gate is open. The Elder Ones have heard your call. Alara felt a chill creep down her spine. The Elder Ones. The name echoed in her mind like a curse. A primal fear gripped her chest. She had heard whispers about the Elder Ones from old texts and forgotten legends, beings that existed before the rise of the Dominion, entities so powerful and ancient that they could bend the very fabric of reality. To think they were now about to step through the rift filled her with an almost overwhelming sense of dread. We need to stop it, she said, her voice sharp with determination. We can't let them come through. The executor's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer, the dark energy around him swirling with purpose. It is not something you can stop. You will learn that the hard way. Without warning, the executor raised his hand toward the rift. The energy around him flared, and the rift's pulsing intensified. It seemed to respond to his touch, growing larger, wider, the shapes within it becoming clearer. They were coming. Ilara knew then that they had only two options left: close the rift or fight what was coming through. Either way, humanity's future depended on their ability to control the power they had just unleashed. And time was running out. The rift tore open wider as the executor's hand hovered above it, his expression a mask of cold determination. Ilara could feel the immense pressure in the air, like the weight of 1,000 worlds bearing down on them. The shapes, no, the beings within the rift were no longer fleeting outlines but solid, shifting horrors, their forms defying all logic. They were both familiar and utterly alien, and their presence sent a shiver of primal fear through her. "We can't fight this," Victor muttered, his rifle lowered, but his grip tight. "Whatever's coming through, we're outmatched." Aiko's eyes darted between the executor and the rift, her face pale with the realization of the stakes. This is beyond any technology we've ever seen. How can we stop it?" Ilara didn't answer immediately. Her thoughts raced. The executor's words haunted her. "The Elder Ones have heard your call." The rift wasn't just a doorway. It was a signal, a beacon to something far worse than any enemy they had ever faced. And the executor, this dark enforcer of the Dominion, seemed almost indifferent to the horrors that were about to be unleashed. But what was the Dominion's true role in all of this? The executor wasn't just trying to stop them, he was trying to control it. And if they let him do that, the Elder Ones would pour through, and humanity's future would be lost forever. "We can't let the Dominion control the rift," Ilara said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If they use it, we might never be able to close it again." The executor's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You still don't understand. You can't stop what is already in motion. The Elder Ones are beyond your comprehension, beyond your petty wars. They are the true masters of this universe." As he spoke, the air around the rift shimmered and fluctuated. There was a violent tearing sound, and then someone emerged. A towering, formless mass of shifting shadows and flickering lights, like a nightmare made real. Ilara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the creature's shape solidify into something resembling a humanoid figure, but far larger, its skin a translucent, iridescent membrane pulsing with a strange, sickly glow. The creature's presence was overwhelming, as if the very space around it bent to its will. Ilara's mind struggled to grasp its form, to comprehend what she was seeing. It felt like looking at something that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space, a being whose existence violated the natural laws of the universe. Another creature followed, then another, their grotesque forms spilling out of the rift like liquid darkness. They were not physical entities, at least not in the way that Ilara understood. They existed in multiple dimensions at once, their bodies warping in ways that defied logic. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an ancient, terrifying intelligence. Ilara's heart raced. This was no mere weapon. It was a conduit, a gateway to an entire other reality. These Elder Ones, whoever they were, had been waiting for centuries, perhaps longer, to return. "What do they want?" Aiko breathed, horror filling her voice. "They want everything," Ilara replied, the weight of the truth settling over her like a heavy blanket. "They want to reshape reality itself." The executor turned toward the emerging creatures, bowing his head slightly in reverence. "You will not control them, human," he said again, his voice barely a whisper now. "You are too small, too insignificant." But Ilara wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on the growing flood of creatures spilling from the rift, their forms twisting and distorting as they spread across the room. They were alien, their shapes impossible to fully understand, but their intent was clear. They were here to claim this world for their own. "We need to act now," Ilara said urgently, turning to Victor and Aiko. "If we don't do something, they'll tear through everything through us." Victor clenched his rifle, his expression hardening with resolve. "We need a plan, something that can stop them." Aiko's mind raced, her fingers twitching as if searching for an answer in the haze of panic. If we can't close the rift, then we'll have to force it to collapse. We need to disrupt whatever energy is sustaining it. Elara nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Disrupt the energy. The artifact had been a source of unimaginable power, but it had also been its own prison, a containment field that kept the rift stable. But now, that power was spilling out uncontrollably. What if we use their own power against them? Eiko said suddenly, her eyes widening with realization. We've seen what the artifact can do. We can redirect its energy into the rift itself. It might destabilize it long enough for us to shut it down. Elara's gaze hardened. It was a desperate gamble. Redirecting the energy back into the rift could cause a catastrophic explosion, but it was their only option. If they didn't act, the Elder Ones would overwhelm them. Humanity's existence might be nothing more than a distant memory. There's no time, Elara said, her voice urgent. Get ready. The executor's mocking smile faded as he realized their intent. You are fools, he growled. You cannot defeat them. But as Elara, Victor, and Eiko rushed toward the artifact's shattered remnants, the rift expanded further. The Elder Ones were no longer simply entering. They were spreading, their tendrils reaching into their reality, and the very air was thick with an energy Elara could scarcely comprehend. The final battle for humanity's survival had begun. The rift pulsed with a deafening hum, the flickering energy it emitted growing sharper, more focused. The Elder Ones, their forms now more substantial, loomed over them like an inescapable nightmare. Elara could hear their unnatural whispers filling the air, ancient voices that seemed to speak not in words, but in thoughts, shifting, ungraspable fragments of an existence beyond her understanding. But there was no time for fear. The plan was set. They had to collapse the rift now, or the world, their world, would be consumed by the chaos pouring through it. Elara dashed toward the broken remains of the artifact, her mind laser-focused. Eiko was already at the control console, her hands flying across the keys in frantic synchronization. Victor was close behind, his weapon still raised, his gaze darting to the creatures that were now crawling across the room, their shifting forms flickering in and out of existence. Their eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed with an eerie, malevolent intelligence, and Elara could feel their presence pressing against her mind, trying to seep into her consciousness. Focus, she muttered to herself. She couldn't let the fear consume her. They had to do this. Eiko's voice came in sharp gasps, the strain of the task evident. I've got it. I can redirect the artifact's energy into the rift, but it's unstable. If we do this wrong, we'll trigger a chain reaction. We'll destroy the whole facility and ourselves. Do it, Elara ordered, her voice hard with resolve. We don't have a choice. Eiko nodded, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the interface. Victor stepped forward, positioning himself to guard them from the creeping horrors moving ever closer. He fired a few shots at one of the Elder Ones, but the energy simply passed through its form like it wasn't even there. It didn't stop. We're not going to win this with bullets, Victor muttered, grimacing. Get that thing working, Eiko. Eiko's brow furrowed in concentration, the strain of controlling such volatile energy causing sweat to bead on her forehead. She was speaking to the machine, her voice barely audible over the low roar of the rift's pulsing energy. Redirecting energy now. Hold on. The energy within the artifact flared to life again, a torrent of raw, primal force. The ground trembled beneath them, and the lights flickered in and out as the very fabric of space seemed to stretch and buckle. For a moment, Elara felt the weight of the universe pressing down on them all, as if the rift itself was aware of their efforts to fight back. Then, with a scream of tortured metal and a final surge of energy, the artifact's energy shot toward the rift like a lightning bolt. The rift expanded outward with an explosive force that nearly knocked them all off their feet. The room cracked and splintered, the walls groaning in protest. For a brief moment, Alara thought they had failed, that the energy would not be enough. But then the rift began to destabilize. The monstrous shapes of the Elder Ones flickered, their forms twisting and distorting, as though the energy from the artifact was counteracting their unnatural presence. The rift pulsed erratically, its edges warping like a shredded fabric, and for the first time, Alara felt a glimmer of hope. "It's working," Eiko gasped, her voice a mix of disbelief and triumph. But the creatures weren't giving up. With a terrible, shrieking cry, the Elder Ones roared, their voices blending into a single terrible sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the room. They pushed forward, their forms shuddering and expanding, trying to break free of the energy now fighting against them. "We can't hold them," Victor shouted, firing once again, but his shots went wide. The energy fields around the rift were distorting everything: space, time, even light itself. "We need to collapse the rift, now," Alara shouted, her voice urgent. The rift was closing, but it was still a long way from sealing completely. And as long as those things were coming through, the battle wasn't over. Eiko's fingers flew over the console, her voice a strained whisper. I'm trying to lock it down. It's resisting." The Elder Ones screamed again, their glowing eyes fixed on Alara and the others. One of them, far larger than the rest, extended a clawed hand, and as it did, the room trembled, the walls shaking as though under the pressure of an invisible hand. The creature's arm shot toward them with terrifying speed. "Eiko, hurry!" Alara shouted, barely ducking as the clawed limb swept through the space where she had just been standing. She felt the air shift with its passage, and her heart slammed in her chest. The room was collapsing around them. Suddenly, with one final, desperate push, Eiko hit a series of keys in rapid succession. The rift's energy flared once more, then exploded. The entire room shook violently, and for a moment, Alara was surrounded by nothing but blinding light. Then, as if the very atmosphere itself had been torn apart, the rift collapsed into itself with a deafening crash. The air around them grew still. The rift, the Elder Ones, the chaos, they were gone. Alara took a shaky breath, looking around. The facility was a wreck, the walls cracked and shattered, the floor littered with debris. Victor lowered his weapon, his face grim. Eiko collapsed against the console, exhausted but alive. "It's over," Alara said, her voice thick with relief and disbelief. We actually did it." But as the silence settled over them, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had shifted. The Elder Ones were gone, but the rift, the artifact, they were still a part of the universe now. They'd won, yes, but the battle was only one chapter in a much larger, darker story. Humanity had survived this day, but the war for their future was far from over. And somewhere in the shadows, the Dominion was watching.